Afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this discussion panel, which is on the subject of artificial intelligence for medical imaging. I'm Dickon Ross. I'm editor-in-chief of a magazine called Engineering and Technology, which kind of does what it says on the tin. We're a pretty broad technology magazine, and artificial intelligence is one of those key happening areas we've been covering for many, many years across all sectors. And the interesting thing about this sector is that it's a kind of really good happening area. There's really solid stuff going on. It's not, sometimes artificial intelligence in some sectors can feel a bit sci-fi-like, but it's really happening in this one. So it's that makes it more real. So I'm going to start by introducing the panel. We have Andrew Davies, who's because he's been introducing all afternoon, Digital Health Lead for the Association of British Health Tech Industries. Professor Emily Jefferson, who is Director of Health Informatics Centre and Professor of Health Data Science at the University of Dundee. Alexandros Poulis, have I pronounced that right? Who is Senior Director of Dataforce. Felix Beecher, Practice Leader of Healthcare Technology at Omdia. And Professor Philip Evans, CVSSP and NPL Professor of Medical Radiation Imaging at Surrey University.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for getting all the letters in.
That's what it says. Okay, and I'm going to kick off by saying, I know we've kind of covered, this should be some degree obvious, but I think it's sometimes helpful to recap, and we discussed this the other day. So why artificial intelligence in medical imaging? What are the most important advantages? Is it speed? Is it accuracy? Is it some other things as well? And what are the best areas? Are we talking about, obviously, as we heard this afternoon, we're talking about cancer, but are we talking about some other big drivers too? So I don't know who would like to take that first. Perhaps Professor Emily, would you like to go first? Yeah.
Professor Emily, that sounds cool.
Emily.
M's fine. It's very well understood. The NHS is really struggling. The cost of healthcare is getting higher and higher in proportion to our GDP, and there's never enough doctors, nurses, and things to provide our healthcare. And AI should hopefully help us streamline those processes and reduce the cost and the benefits to patients in terms of getting healthcare faster and better.
Speed and efficiency and cost. Okay.
All of those.
All of those. Okay. Andrew.
I mean, that's a pretty comprehensive list there. I think for me, the number one issue that keeps coming up is workforce. We just don't have enough, particularly radiologists in the NHS. And it's a global shortage as well, it's not just the NHS. So having the tools to support them, to enable them to focus on the really critical and more complex cases and deal with the more routine cases through AI really makes a difference to throughput and workforce efficiency.
So we're talking very much about artificial intelligence augmenting the human role and making it more efficient and speeding it up rather than replacing it. I think everyone agrees on that, right? That's the
despite my last question about when it would replace, yes.
Okay, Felix.
First of all, I agree with all of that, but also I'd say that there are some circumstances in which AI systems can do things which humans just cannot do at all. You know, it's not just that AI systems can do things better or faster, more efficiently. They can see patterns in data which are completely invisible to humans or clinicians, even in data which may not seem that clinically relevant. And the example that I have at the top of my mind is the research that I did last year on prostate cancer. And the objective of the research was to try and develop a system which could predict good responses to a standard drug for prostate cancer treatment. And the kind of data that we used there was just very standard data, things like height, weight, demographics, concomitant medications, symptoms, medical history, things like that. Now, what machine learning was able to do, 2 years in advance, by the way, was to be able to look at patterns within that data and to be able to make pretty accurate predictions about whether people would respond well to a drug or not. I mean, to me, this is a great example, not just because it's mine, but because it's an example of where AI can just do things which seem kind of magical.
Not so, in a sense, asking questions that might not otherwise be asked because it can spot things in the patterns that people haven't spotted. I mean, that's true of artificial intelligence, big data across all the sectors, but it's life-saving in this one, potentially. Yeah. Okay. And Philip.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that there's obviously issues of workload and things like that, but I think what you say is right, that we can do things that we couldn't do otherwise, potentially with AI. And you gave the example of predicting outcome for prostate cancer. I mean, one of the things we're looking at is you take data for patients treated with lung cancer. So I pretty well work in cancer, so everything I will say will be about cancer, I'm afraid. So you take patient characteristics data, treatment characteristics data, and things like imaging data, and then you try to use those to predict prognosis. So what's the best treatment for this patient? What's the likely outcome? And AI is really sort of demonstrating a strong role there. But I think it has to come back, though, to, shall we say, onto the clinician's desk. You know, one of my colleagues at Royal Surrey Hospital is the British Institute of Radiology lead on AI. He's a radiologist, and he sees that, you know, some of his colleagues are concerned about being replaced by AI. He's not worried about it, and he doesn't really think it's going to happen. It's actually using technology to augment and help him do his job. So, you know, he reads, say, lots of PET scans from patients, and what he really wants to be able to do is something to help him say, these cases, you know, there's no issue here. You probably don't need to look at them closely. There are some cases where, unfortunately, there probably is a cancer, and this needs, you know, a look in this region. But then there are cases that are in the middle. So actually allowing him to devote his time to the difficult cases supported by the AI, partly helping him to sift through the cases, is, I think, a second example of where it, you know, helps us to achieve more than, you know, dealing with shortages of staff and that. It actually helps our clinical colleagues to do things, to focus on things that they should more be focused on.
Even just simple prioritization.
Yeah.
It's really invaluable. Okay. And that's quite a lot. Alexandros, have you got anything to add to that, rather? Waiting time.
I think they covered almost everything.
Yeah.
So what I could add here is that there was some research a couple of years ago that showed, at least in the US, more than 50% of medical practitioners didn't even have time to go through a patient's medical history. And we're in a situation where the data that is being collected about patients keeps increasing because it's also beyond the medical images, right? We have all these sensors, we have wearable devices that we can take advantage of, we have the clinical notes. So that, and AI gives us the possibility to leverage different data sources and different signals. So that's one more thing that that medical professionals would never have the possibility to do without AI. So combining AI as a decision support system in a human in the loop, as we say, workflow seems to be the most productive trend right now.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to open it up to questions in a second. I'm just going to ask one more and go back down the line. So I'll start with you again, Alexandros. But okay, so these are all the wonderful things we can expect and hope for from artificial intelligence in medical imaging. So what are the obstacles? What are the challenges? What are the issues that we need to overcome to make these wonderful things a reality? And I'm thinking of things like data integrity, trust, consent, and so on. There'll be a whole other, I'm sure you'll all have your own suggestions, but Alexandros, I think, you know, you're in the data area, so what are the challenges in the data side?
There are too many challenges. So I'll start with a particular case because that's what I focus on. So when data scientists start with a vision of developing machine learning models to to tackle specific use cases. They need high quality labeled data often, and medical data more often than not need to be labeled by medical professionals. So that's a problem because it's a time-consuming and expensive task. Right? So we are that problem. So teams like ours take care of that time-consuming and expensive, the data labeling part. Because in most publicly available data sets, the data is not consistently labeled or not labeled at all. So it can be unstructured, completely unstructured, or inconsistently structured. And the result is that the machine learning model that will be based on that data will not be reliable enough, right? So we need a mechanism to efficiently and quickly label the data so that data scientists can be more productive and produce more accurate products. So that's only one of the problems, but I would like my co-panelists to contribute their ideas as well.
Sorry, Emily, yes.
Cool, thanks. I'm going to do a shameless pitch for my talk in like an hour or something. So I'm going to be going through, on that talk, a range of different challenges of accessing unconsented large cohorts of data for research. So a kind of a vision for me is to be able to use all of the population-wide data that's collected in order to advance AI and be able to use that. But obviously, you've got major concerns around public trust, data confidentiality, and like everybody else in this room, I don't like the idea of my GP notes getting out there or something like that, or somebody being able to find that information. So we're doing some work on something called trusted research environments, which are environments where you can actually access unconsented data that's pseudonymized and develop your AI within that environment, but without actually taking the data out. And the idea around labeling is that you can actually label some of this data by linking the imaging data with longitudinal healthcare records within one place and develop your tool, and then actually go through a disclosure control process to make sure that basically you can't kind of hack the algorithm. But there's so many different challenges with doing that in terms of making sure that this is legal, technical controls, how do you make sure that the processes are there, and that when you're actually checking that the algorithm doesn't contain anything, that you're doing that appropriately. And then also, companies don't necessarily want to work within those sorts of constrained environments. They want the data out in the wild, being managed by themselves and being able to be stored for regulatory purposes. So there are real challenges there, both in terms of the requirements for the research community or the companies using that data versus the public trust and confidentiality. And you've got to weigh up these different concerns.
Okay, thank you. Yes,
Yeah.
Philip. Yeah.
I quite agree with you. I mean, data access is quite a minefield. And we run the risk of reaching the point that only really big players who can afford to deal with the legal matters can do this kind of research. Now, the big players that do great work, they're very important, but also the small players are also important, and we need to be careful we don't end with a framework that actually doesn't work for them. And your point about the sort of quality of data, we're in a kind of, we're quite unique, I think, in healthcare data, because really high quality data generally comes from clinical trials, and usually that's fairly small data sets. I'm thinking of, say, national trials of cancer in the UK. It might be, say, 1,000 cases. That my colleagues in my department to apply AI to identifying sort of say, an animal against a background, that kind of stuff. You know, they're dealing with millions of images from Google. So there is a real challenge there, I think, actually in translating some of these techniques to what really are smaller data sets. And that's still, I think, one of the outstanding challenges in AI in healthcare.
So you're saying that it's reliant on very big, the techniques tend to be a device for big data sets?
Yeah, I'm thinking of some of the deep neural network type approaches. You know, you need a lot of data to train your neural network till it comes to new data.
Okay. And sorry. Yeah. Yes. Questions from the audience, please. Have we got any so far before I crack on with that? Okay, we'll have a think. Oh, yes, one at the front here, please. Yeah. Sorry, I think they'll bring a mic to you.
Thank you. You see all of this data incorporated into a database. My biggest questioning after reviewing tons of data myself is the impacts that you might have based on ethnicity, race, sex, and so on. And I don't think anyone is really speaking about this. I'm trying to understand, what do you think are the challenges and the opportunities on figuring out all of this?
So AI bias, guys, who would like to go first?
I'm happy to jump in here. I think a lot of people are talking about that, actually, especially in the United States. And I mean, my personal feeling is that this is actually not the biggest problem at all, because unless we get AI systems into clinical practice, it doesn't matter whether they discriminate on the basis of race, and sometimes, because it's not being done at all. And that's kind of where we are now. I think there are two massive problems that we have. One is about infrastructure, and Alexandros kind of touched on that already. It's very difficult for an AI developer to get the data, and then to do doing the development is the easy part, but then to get it approved and then to get it deployed in clinical practice, that's very, very hard. And it's to try and imagine how we can restructure the healthcare system is just kind of slightly mind-bending. It's almost like we have to start from the ground up. And then I think that another big problem is culture, and these are both very big problems. The cultural problem is completely different, because that's really about what your attitude is. Because I think the problem of infrastructure we would all agree on. The problem of culture we would probably all disagree on, because some of us would say we need to change the culture, we need to, the medical profession needs to be more accepting of AI, people in general need to be more accepting of AI, so do policymakers. And then policymakers and regulators might say, hang on, we need to calm down, we need to see what's going on here, and we need to take it slowly. That's really a difficult kind of, it's almost like a personality issue. So I see those two big problems as being pretty important. And the kind of racial bias thing, to me, that's almost a kind of fine-tuning thing that has to be done when we have AI systems deployed in healthcare at all, which we don't really very much at the moment.
It has been a huge problem in other areas of AI. You're not convinced in medical?
You're right, yeah, but in health, I'm not aware of any major crises, but I could be wrong.
No, you're right, there are no major crises, but it obviously is an important consideration, isn't it? I guess that's what the questioner is asking. And, you might have a particular disease that is quite a different phenotype, say, amongst one racial group compared with another. And it might be a consequence of things like different styles of living. I mean, the classic thing is there are differences in head and neck cancer between Europe and Asia because the diet's different. They're actually quite different diseases, but one could imagine somebody naively just applying an AI solution for head and neck cancer developed in Europe to India. So, one has to be careful of those sorts of things. So you have to be aware, I think, of the background and the limitations of the data that's gone into your system. Yeah. But I think we are right. A lot of people are really looking into this, fundamentally, and it's an important question. It's being addressed.
Actually, 41%, at least in the US, 41% of companies that were asked on a Stanford survey said that they do care about fairness and equality in data, but less than 25% are actually doing something about that. So it's true that a lot of people are talking about that.
Andrew.
So I mean, I agree with what's been said. This is absolutely being talked about, and it's not just being talked about, it is being built into policies, into standards, and these sorts of approaches. It's not there or perfect yet, but it's happening. But it's also just a facet or magnification, I'm not sure which, of what's already happening within the health system, whether it's anything to do with AI or not. There is inequalities within our health system. The issue we have, particularly with AI, is it can build that into a system and impact people much more widely if it's used inappropriately.
And as we've seen in other areas, it can amplify it. It reproduces and then amplifies, and that's the worry and the danger. Yeah. Anyone else want to say any more about this important subject before we move on?
I'd just say that I think it's part of the responsibility of any group adopting an AI solution to check and validate that solution works across the whole spectrum of the population. And as soon as they check and validate and go, well, this is just rubbish for this ethnic group, it was trained on the wrong group, that will certainly make sure that people who are training it and companies who are developing those sorts of things are going to seek more data to train on that particular area if basically they're not selling it because of the validation step. And I think that there should be a framework around whenever you're accepting or utilising an AI solution, that it has to pass certain checks around that.
I think I would go a bit further. Absolutely, someone who's adopting it's got to validate it, but it's got to be a joint responsibility between the developer and the adopter. Develop it right, implement it right, but then the ongoing monitoring as well of how
it was more in response to the idea that only 25% of people are doing something about it. If basically they can't sell their solution because it's not trained in the right way, then that's going to incentivize people, I suppose, to make sure that they are training it correctly.
Obviously, bias in AI is a big issue across the whole of that sector, but it's when one talks to the AI specialists, they often say, well, we're perhaps part of the solution as well. I mean, it's not like people aren't racist or biased or the things that it may be helping out. Is there a potential here for it to improve the bias situation, to be less biased? Does anyone believe that?
Absolutely, I think that there's absolutely that possibility to take some inequalities out of the system, but ensuring you're doing your audit on the data, the representation within your training set, you're validating on another training set, which you also know the makeup of.
We're just yet to see it in practice, perhaps.
We're yet to see a lot of things in practice in terms of AI in the health service. There's a lot of technologies deployed. I think the latest was over 160 AI technologies deployed in the NHS. That's Health Education England data, but it's very sporadic.
Yeah.
Can I add something to that as well?
Yes,
it's very tempting. Always, this happens a lot. There's a certain fallacy, and I'm going to call it the false comparison to perfection fallacy, because what happens with AI systems a lot is that people see how it's doing something less than perfectly. And that somehow is a criticism. But of course, the true comparison is not perfection, it's what's being done in the status quo or what's being done in human and clinical practice. And I think we have to bear that in mind. We have to remind ourselves, for example, that there are all sorts of inequalities in the health profession, as in life in general, already. And that's what we shouldn't hold too high a standard up for AI systems.
The developers are always reminding us of that. So.
I think when it comes to bias, we've taken a huge step forward, which is acknowledging that there is bias, because it's very hard for us as humans to see that, right? I'm biased, but I may not realize in what areas exactly I'm biased. So we've acknowledged that as a research community, as an industry. So there's now it's about implementing solutions, and there's a couple of algorithmic checks and mechanisms to go around that to a certain extent. But I think one big thing that we need to do is try to break the data silos, right? There's so much data that in India, for example, that researchers in Europe cannot use, and there's so much data in the UK that researchers in the EU may not be able to use. So how can we break those silos? Or maintain them, but use some kind of federated learning to introduce more diversity to the data sets.
Okay, good, thank you. Another question at the back there, please. Thanks.
Hi. So thank you very much for all the panel. But I personally think that probably the biggest problem has not been tackled yet. Yes, data curation is a problem, but it can be done. Use of the de-identification and pseudonymization of data is difficult, but it can be done. Training, verification can be done. But what I find still very hard is the acceptance of the technology in the outside world. Everybody loves the idea of being driven by a car in a taxi without a driver. But very, very few people would accept to having been diagnosed by a software. And that's purely, this comes from a person that has put several software as a medical device on the market. So I'm on your side if you want. But my question to the panel is, what has been done to make sure that the public and the potential user actually accept and understand the technology that has been used?
Okay, so why should anyone trust this? I think there was someone there. Who'd like to go first?
I'm happy to. I'm just starting off a piece of research at the moment, actually, and it's about attitudes to radiologists and radiographers. Now, this is kind of like an oblique way of answering your question, right? Because it seems to me that if somebody's going into a clinic and the radiographer or the clinician who they're talking to is happy and comfortable and persuaded by the technology, then the patient will be too. So in other words, maybe this is not a question of persuading the general public, who, after all, you know, as I said earlier, I have zero idea really how my phone works. That doesn't stop me using it or being happy with my phone. Same is true of my car. Same is even true of my toaster, probably. So I don't, in a way, without wanting to seem elitist, people don't have to understand it. People do have to accept it, but that might be led by the clinical, you know, by the medical profession and the clinicians who they're actually dealing with.
So, yeah, I mean, Felix, back to what you're saying, you know, basically the comparison isn't with what's perfect, it's what's with existing. And I think when you go to your doctor and they give you a pill, you probably, some of you might, but you probably don't say, well, what's the mode of action of this pill? You trust your healthcare professional that they know what they're prescribing to you. And you don't say, you know, what's this going to release into my body? How's it going to act? I think to Felix's point, it's going to be the same thing with AI. Well, or my wife, but I think in the majority. I think the same is going to be true with AI. If the healthcare professional is confident in using it and using it with the patient, that will go a long way. Is enough being done to build the confidence with the healthcare professional? Not yet, would be my take on it. But again, it's works in progress that various, speaking for the UK, that various bodies are looking at.
I think that we're not at the level where patients interface with the AI directly. They interface with the doctor, so the AI is just another tool right now. And I think, I'm pretty confident that there are cases where the doctors are already using AI or the output of AI, and the patient may not know it. Maybe they signed a consent at some point when they're admitted, but they probably don't know about it. And that, I mean, it's used in a good way.
Yeah, I was sort of thinking, I think I have a more positive view of it. I mean, I just think of how, you know, I'm getting quite old, I'm nearly 60. I think when I used to go to the doctor 40 years ago, I had some complex set of symptoms. He'd get a few books out and have a look at them. Now my doctor types into a computer and, you know, looks up various things. And so technology, right at the sort of primary care level, is being used more and more, accepted more and more. But there is the perception of AI, I think, in society. But it's beyond healthcare. Colleagues of mine work on driverless vehicles, and there's this whole discussion, you know, if a driverless vehicle has a crash, who is responsible? And my colleague Rich, his response is, well, you know, cars driven by people have crashes. My driverless cars will probably have fewer crashes, but it's seen as a different type of problem almost. So we need to, I think, get people more familiar, more accepting of some AI technology as it's used. And, you know, often, the press, some aspects of the press aren't always positive about AI. You know, they want a nice story that says AI's screwed up here or something like that. Sorry, yeah, thank you.
Emily, you got anything to add to the trust issue?
Just I think if you use the example of radiology, making sure that something that is really critical needs to be looked at faster, and ordering, you know, the way in which radiologists look at particular scans, it's never occurs to the patient that that's actually what's happening behind the scenes, or the fact that the second reader could be a machine rather than a radiologist. One radiologist still looks at it, but the second reader is an AI tool, and that means that you don't have to kind of pay for two different radiologists. And again, the patient never kind of sees that. So I think it's more around the adoption by the healthcare professionals and health boards rather than necessarily by the general public.
Okay. And on the trust issue, is the health industry not in a good position here, because people tend to trust health professionals, and that's who'll be presenting it to them. Am I because if I can trust it to other areas where people don't trust the technologists or the.
But quite rightly, though, it can be quite conservative, which in many cases is a very positive thing. And there's a whole range of views, isn't there, I think, across healthcare professionals. And
Yeah, okay.
there's still a strong...
I think we need to do more work with health boards in terms of education and helping them assess within a sort of a standardised framework when AI is something they want to adopt and when they don't, and what the checks and balances they should be using to make those decisions. Because as you say, it's not routinely used. Did you say 160 examples? That's nothing, right? It should be everywhere within the NHS. That's absolutely very much in its infancy. But in order to do this, rather than health boards being scared, what happens if we get sued, this, that, and the other, there needs to be a big push in terms of how to help them work out which algorithms to choose, how, when, what the balances are for adopting it.
Okay. I did actually see a survey on trust before I came on. It was something like 80% of the public trust AI to make the medical imaging decisions, or on their own or with conjunction with professionals. And interestingly, it was higher as you got younger. Perhaps that's to be expected. I don't know, but sometimes it works the other way actually. But yeah, okay. And any more questions at this point? Yes, gentlemen.
Great, thanks very much. I wonder if some of the challenges around trust are to do with the evidence or lack of evidence of actually this stuff working. So question for the panel, what would you say is the minimum standard that medical AI should reach before it's sort of unleashed on the population?
Blimey. Andrew, you want?
I won't answer that precisely because that's outside of my expertise. But what I would say is that there's a clear framework in UK. I can decide whether it was England or the UK. A clear framework in the UK, which is published by NICE for what evidence is necessary for different tiers of digital health technologies, but also including AI technologies. So that sets a standard. So there's tiers depending on basically the risk. Is it software as a medical device? Is it just a diary? There's also a sort of subset that if you want to bring a product to market early, a subset of evidence you could use and build the evidence base while in market. So I think we got a good framework there, and actually that's being recognised internationally as well as a good framework.
Emily, yeah?
97.24%. I'll go with what he says. So basically, in exactly the same, it needs to be a framework that you utilise to work out on a case-by-case basis whether this particular tool is helpful. There'll be some really rubbish AI tools out there. We don't want to use them. I don't want them used in my healthcare. You've just got to assess them on a case-by-case basis using such a framework.
In some cases, just saving 1 second in the patient's journey, right? If you can diagnose a stroke 1 second or 2 minutes faster, could potentially be enough to use it in real life, right?
Yeah.
Could save somebody from paralysis. It could save a life.
No, there is no magic number, is there, to answer that, is it, unfortunately? Yeah.
Does it balance against cost?
Well, then we get into health economics, So,
this is the whole regulatory issue. Is that we want to talk more? Where are we with the? Does this need more regulation before it becomes mainstream?
Look, let me add something there. This is very subjective, and Emily's absolutely correct that there's lots of rubbish AI. People need to be wary, but my personal feeling is very subjective, like I said, is that the barriers are far too high, and that's a big problem about what is complex why the barriers are very high, not just to do with regulation, but largely to do with regulation. It's very difficult for small developers to get something approved as a diagnostic tool, for example. And that's really a problem, I think, and how we address that is really difficult to judge because, of course, if we lower the barriers, there are risks to that, but there are also risks of not lowering the barriers as well.
But it has to be navigable. That's the key point, isn't it? You know, it's got to be navigable if you're not a big player to actually get something out there.
Yes. Okay. Any more questions? Yes, gentleman there.
Hi. So I have a question about digital clinical workflows. So you could argue that medical imaging is where AI is showing the greatest traction in terms of adoption. And that the reason for that is because there's an established digital workflow where it's relatively straightforward to essentially hook in an AI capability. So I guess my question is, well, A, would you agree with that? And secondly, what are the other high-impact established digital workflows where it would be quite straightforward, for instance, for us to start looking at, you know, kind of straightforward ways of introducing AI?
This is really too practitioner for me to fully grasp, but anyone want to take that on?
I can not exactly answer it again, but I can make a comment. The key areas where AI is currently being adopted, one is diagnostics, and you made the point about digital workflow. The two other ones are around population health management and around remote monitoring. I'm not so sure about, population health management is all about data analytics, and now they're applying AI to it. So again, it's fitting into that. Remote monitoring is building on existing infrastructure, but again, not necessarily digital even, a lot still analog, but it's building on a technology base. So I think there's merit in what you're suggesting, that it's easier where technology is a big play already.
Anyone else?
Yeah. The other area as well is, I don't know whether it's partly related to those ones, but it's around capacity planning and planning for bed spaces and things like that. So more kind of the hospital management trying to use AI to learn from patterns to see kind of how busy they're going to be, how many staff they need, and all of those sorts of things.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. Very little time left, if any, but might have time for one more question. Yes, one more.
So just a comment on the question about the threshold. We have an established mechanism for deciding whether something should be used in medicine or not, which is the clinical trial. And I'm curious why that wasn't the answer, and why you think that there's something more complicated than just that.
I think the point is there isn't a magic number here. So let's say we have an intervention where let's take radiology. A trained radiologist has say an accuracy of 0.9. Then if I'm developing AI to supplement what that radiologist does, then it's got to be close in his performance at least, otherwise it's useless. So it's determined, I think, by what is the state of the art for answering a specific question. That, to me, seems to be how we kind of set what the requirement is. It's what's the current standard without AI?
This is $1 million question right across artificial intelligence adoption. Actually, it comes as driverless vehicles and everything. Obviously, there's a lot of accidents happening on the road all the time, but as soon as there's one in the driverless vehicle, everyone's, that's a problem. Anyone else want to come back on this again? I'm going to wrap it up there. I think that's probably all we've got time. Yes, it is all we've got time for. But thank you, everyone. Thanks for the panel. Please join me in thanking them all.
Thank you.
Thanks.